Genshin doesn't really have a neat little box that it fits into. Some might call it an adventure game, but that's vague. Mario Odyssey and Elden Ring are both adventure games, but to pretend they are anywhere near the same experience would be disingenuous. Well, what if I told you Genshin itself isn't sure what it is? And neither are the people who play it, including me. Genshin has an identity problem. It wants to be certain things while doing other things that go against what it's trying to be. The game executes well on its original ideas. It just works against them or sends mixed messages about what that idea should be. And I believe it's these incongruous ideas that often has the game's community divided so much, because the game sends mixed messages of what it's even trying to do. So, here I'm going to outline 6 pillars of uncertain identity in Genshin, as well as briefly explain why they are problematic and how they cause either confusion or division in its own player base. These pillars will be as follows: economy, difficulty, time investment, target audience, cultural inspiration, and narrative insert. Without delay, let's get into them. In my essay, The Implications of Selling Combat, I said the following. And on that, I believe combat really matters in this game. Maybe more than anything. But why would I feel that way? Well, I look at how much resin refreshes cost, and constellations, aka battle passives, and that tells me all I need to know. I didn't come up with that conclusion myself. With the absurd amount of money one can spend on combat-related things, Hoyo is screaming at me that it's a combat game. In that essay, my main point was that due to Hoyoverse's primary revenue coming from selling combat power through characters, constellations, and weapons, it makes sense for someone to assume that at its core, Genshin is a combat game. Sure, you can buy a cute skin for your character, but weapons and constellations can cost hundreds. And the only thing weapons and constellations do is provide combat power. On top of that, resin can only be used to make your character more powerful. It's used for bosses, talent books, artifacts, and weapon materials. The thing all these have in common? Making your character stronger. Resin, the FOMO tactic that keeps people coming back every day to spend it, is only usable to make a character stronger. You can't use it for a new skin, or to unlock special stories, or new dialogue, or anything else. And again, that's all constellations do as well, they're just passives. You can argue that getting a character the first time could be for some collector's purpose, but any character copy after the first is purely for combat strength. So, when looking from the outside in, putting yourself in the shoes of someone unfamiliar with Genshin or the gacha genre, wouldn't it be understandable to assume the game is heavily combat related, if not combat first and foremost? Again, keeping in the mindset of someone unfamiliar with the game, imagine a friend tells you they just spent $200 in Genshin. Your eyes go wide and you ask them, on what? Skins? A new story mode? A whole new map? What could have costed you $200? And their answer is, no, my Yelan can dash twice now with her skill. The resulting conclusion from someone who knows nothing about the game would justifiably be, oh whoa, $200 so a character can use their skill twice? That game must be combat heavy. In my humble opinion, that wouldn't be a random leap of logic, that would be the logical conclusion, the right conclusion. Constellations, weapons, resin refreshes, map packs in the shop. The game's economy is 98% combat power. And surely if you can spend that much money on just making a character stronger, then combat has to be like the main facet of the game, right? And yet, it's not entirely the right conclusion. Genshin is a combat game, yes, but it's debatable whether it's a combat game first and foremost. It's a story game, a glorified visual novel at times. It's an exploration game. It can be a card game if that's your main focus. It's a village builder. It's a combat game as well, just not necessarily primarily. And this is where the mixed messaging comes in and causes confusion in the player base, because the most monetized aspect of the game, combat power, isn't necessarily the central focus of the game. There's only 2 modes of repeatable combat content in the game, Abyss and Theater. And Theater we just now got after 4 years. On top of that, they're not even fully repeatable, they're just semi-repeatable because they reset in cycles. The question, why is combat power, the thing so heavily monetized, becomes valid. People who invest monetarily expect the game to match that investment with congruent purpose. If, for instance, pooling is really just about collecting cute characters, why not revolve the economy and constellation system around something like skins instead? Instead of a character's exclusive weapon making them stronger, why not just focus on fancy effects and matching aesthetics? But that's not the case. Character strength is tied to these things, and mixed messaging results as a result. Is that redundant? Selling combat power creates an expectation of what the game is at its core, especially for the uninitiated to these types of games. And Genshin takes a fairly long time to get to its repeatable in-game stages, enough to where by the time someone reaches that stage, they might have already monetarily invested in that combat power before realizing it's not really that kind of game. For new players, the world is so big now and there's so much to get into that there's a lot to keep them busy and distracted. However, at some point, it's likely even many of them will say, okay, I've built these characters, or even, I've bought this constellation, but for what? But it's too late at that point. There are cases of successful games with economies that don't tie into the game's main purpose. For instance, League of Legends is a team PvP game that is strategy and battle focused, but its economy is skin-based, not battle-based. That might seem like an incongruous economy at first. However, with it being a team PvP game, selling combat power would directly ruin the competitive ecosystem of that game. Genshin is a single-player PvE game, though, that does sell combat power. And as a result, it's no wonder so many players are left confused and upset when they don't get combat primarily. Genshin's economy, as a result, is a case of uncertain identity. Genshin has an uncertain identity with respects to difficulty as well, and it somewhat ties into the game's mistaken economy identity, though they are separate things. Genshin is uncertain how difficult it wants to be. As long as a player is keeping up with the game at their level, there's rarely, if ever, a time in which enemy difficulty comes into play. Mobs are paper thin and disappear in an instant when attacked, and team compositions are left up to the whims of the player. Open world challenges are also quite simple, oftentimes just requiring the player to perform a task as simple as running from point A to point B, or collecting all the orbs in a line. Puzzles are generally simple as well, requiring basic functions and logic. Going back to the Abyss though, and now Theater as well, this idea of simple gaming is thrown out the window. Deeper investment of characters is required. A better understanding of reactions, weapon passives, and talents becomes mandatory. And a higher degree of personal mechanical skill becomes an asset. Attacking while standing still may end up with one's demise. Dodging and positioning becomes key. Not only this, but having appropriately built characters matters as well. For later stages of the Abyss, you want at least 8 heavily vertically invested characters, and for Theater you want, well, let's be honest, as many moderately horizontally invested characters as possible. The difference from the open world experience is pretty drastic. Importantly though, the game never hints that this is what one should strive for. The intensity of battles and the story's quests in the open world do little to prepare players for harder, semi-repeatable content. It tells players on the outside that it wants to be a simple, lighthearted game. But the investment in difficulty of the in-game mode suggests that one should be buckling down and making characters as strong as possible. This is, once again, mixed messaging. Some players see the Abyss and now Theater as proof that the game wants player investment, and thus should be centered around ramping difficulty, while other players see the simplicity of the open world experience as proof that the game isn't based around ramping difficulty. These opposing views aren't either side's faults. It's the expected result from having an uncertain difficulty identity, and the mixed messaging that comes from that. Players who see the game as a simple experience and like it as such want to protect that easygoing experience. So when harder content is shoved into the game, especially content that has rewards behind it such as primogems, they feel punished for viewing the game and treating the game as a simple experience. On the other side, for players who view Genshin as a game that should have ramping difficulty, the stagnation and lack of new challenges becomes boring. Both sides are convinced that their vision of the game makes the most sense, but neither side is incorrect, and no, that's not a position born of fence-sitting. Genshin is the one that doesn't make it clear what it wants to be from a difficulty standpoint, and sends mixed messages to both sides with its gameplay. After Inazuma, the open world has gotten easier and easier to deal with, to the point now that there are enemies in Fontaine, if you can call them enemies, that don't fight back or move at all when you attack them, such as the crabs and seals. Combat underwater is also simplistic, stripping away all your character's kits and standardizing them into uniform functions. However, local legends were also introduced in Fontaine, enemies that can two-shot your characters if you're not careful. We also just got a new in-game mode during Fontaine, Imaginarium Theater, that wants to test our mastery of a huge roster. And for these players, they're that much more convinced that the game should be geared towards more difficulty, due to the ramp up in challenge and also due to the first case of uncertain identity, the economy. The world got easier and the modes got harder. Genshin's not sure which way it wants to go with its difficulty. However, the separate camps take it upon themselves to battle one another, rather than taking a step back and realizing that the other side feels like they do as a result of Genshin's difficulty having an uncertain identity. Leading off from Genshin's uncertain identities in both economy and difficulty, time investment is the next pillar. Simply put, is this a game that is meant to be played a few minutes a day and you log off? Or are you supposed to treat it as a game you dive deeply into, devoting longer periods of time to, maybe even hours? You may see a pattern here, but Genshin sends mixed messages as to which is the correct way to view the game, and the confusion that results stems from multiple factors. Everything from the game being a gacha, which in the minds of gacha veterans translates to short bursts of entertainment, to certain Archon and world quests, which take hours to complete. Events and resin can be finished in no time, but exploring and scouring the open world takes devotion and time well beyond a few minutes a day. Players that see Genshin as a traditional gacha game are fine with logging on a few minutes a day. That's the opposite of players that see Genshin as more than that though, and would like to see further in-game modes and long-term goals implemented into the game. The same as with Genshin's case of uncertain identity with respects to its difficulty, these two opposing camps of players, those who believe it's a game for short daily bursts, and those who believe it's a game for longer periods of extended play find themselves at odds with one another. The ideas of the opposing groups threatens the daily cycle or long-term outlook of what the game would be. But, just as with the difficulty, it's neither group's fault for feeling the way they do. It's more so the result of Genshin's mixed messaging. Both groups are told that what they believe is the correct way to view the game. Players who advocate for longer play cycles, whether that's through more in-game modes or more stuff to do in the open world, are often met with opposition along the lines of, "It's a gacha game, it's only meant to be played a few minutes per day on a daily commute or something." Or, "You no-lifed the game and then complain there's nothing else in the world to do." These responses are both hostile and confusing to the players advocating for longer play cycles though, because the game does demand long sessions of times from players. For a game in which play cycles are supposed to be short, World Quest and Archon Quest take hours to complete. Not only this, but the dialogue isn't even skippable. The world has tons of oculi to find, several side quests and stories to tell. From these perspectives, the game absolutely does demand time from the player, just it's not core combat or battle time necessarily. But the notion that you aren't supposed to spend any prolonged time on the game is contradicted by how much dialogue and story one is supposed to go through. The converse also ends up being true, however. Yes, players who want longer daily cycles involving combat and other gameplay loops are often met with, "The game is supposed to only be played a few minutes a day." But when players express they'd like their time to go faster, such as with a dialogue skip or story skip option, they are met with an equally vexing, "You're supposed to take your time and pay attention to the dialogue and story." These are two completely incongruous ideas. If the game is truly meant to be played in short bursts every day, then a skip button to help expedite the process would help to support this notion. Okay then, let me skip all this fluffy text and get along with my dailies so I can get along with my day then. It's more mixed signals. By nature of being a gacha with limited resin every day and quick play cycles, there is an impression that it's supposed to be experienced in short bursts. The time that must be devoted to completely unskippable dialogue in quests, as well as the length of the quests themselves though, would suggest otherwise. Players who are looking for more game time are met with comments telling them it's not the kind of game you play all day. But when players actually want to speed up the experience with something like dialogue skip or story skip so they don't have to play all day, there's few or no ways to make it go faster, and they are told in essence that it's a game in which you are supposed to sit through it for long periods of time. You're expected to devote tons of time to the game, just not tons of time playing it. Whether a player is looking for longer play cycles or looking for a way to shorten their time on the game, neither is well accommodated. You can look at either end and not be sure just how much time you're supposed to devote to the game. Does the game identify as a traditional short burst game, or are you supposed to sit down with a clear schedule before doing something like heading into these quests, or searching for oculi? For these reasons, mixed messages and signals of time investment contribute to Genshin's case of uncertain identity. When you consider the economy, difficulty, and time investments as a whole, you can then ask yourself, who is Genshin for? Who is the target audience? But it goes beyond the economy, difficulty, and time investments. Who is Genshin for? Younger players? Older players? Cozy gamers? Heavy gamers? Story and lore lovers who don't care about combat? Combat lovers who could care less about story? It's hard to answer the question of the target audience because the game attempts to do so many things. Paimon repeats things over and over as if she's trying to get children to understand it. It feels like the game expects either kids or dummies to be behind the controls, and yet, read the lore, read some of the skill descriptions, and you'll get some of the worst bloated text in the game. The lore itself is more involved than you'd expect any youngster to care about, and yet we're not expected to be able to understand what a random NPC told us without it being repeated 4 times before exiting dialogue. Economically speaking as well, we can be for sure that it's not kids spending hundreds of dollars on these characters. At the same time, earlier outfits in the game got censored for being too revealing. Are we adults here or not? Aesthetics are also uncertain. The world is bright and colorful, almost cartoonish, but some of the stories are quite dark and bleak. You can also ask the same with cozy gamers versus combat gamers. Just leave age or aesthetics out of it. Going back to difficulty, the game wants to build a simple playground for cozy gamers, with things like semi-on-rail stories, minimal challenge, and village building. Yet it punishes them by putting periodic primogems behind 2 in-game modes, which are decidedly non-cozy. Combat gamers also don't get much of a break though. With these modes on cycle, after clearing them, there's not much more combat gaming to do for prolonged periods of time, other than more character building or exploration. But the domains and open world offer substantially less challenge than either Abyss or Theater. Whether you're young, old, a wholesome content lover, mature content lover, cozy gamer, combat gamer, or any of several other dichotomies, story enjoyers versus non-story enjoyers, exploration lovers versus those who don't enjoy it, min-maxers versus those who just want to collect characters, the game doesn't entirely know where to aim its targets. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. By being a game that targets many different kinds of gamers, we have a game that can be enjoyed by many. But without any commitment to either direction, players are often left only feeling partially satisfied, or in some cases even threatened by the opposite side of the dichotomy due to being afraid the game will change too much in the other direction, ceasing to be the game they like. Genshin wants to be a game for everyone, sometimes doing well in that regard and other times dropping the ball. But with no particular target audiences in mind, it's fair to say that the audience has an uncertain identity. Oh boy, this one is a doozy. This section will be a bit longer than the other ones, but there is a lot to say here. It's not more important than any of the other pillars, but it's no less either. It's just there's a lot to go through here. Newsflash, fun fact, I am a Black American. I don't know how many knew that, I never make it a point of my essays, but that's a fact. I'm a Black American with Black slave ancestry. From this point of view, this section might lean a little more towards a particular side, but I'll still try to explain it as evenly as possible. Genshin doesn't know exactly how it wants to approach the cultures that it takes its regional inspirations from. It wants to portray them, it wants to model the nations after them, but it doesn't want to step outside of particular comfort zones. We all know what I'm talking about here. The Natlan cast appears to be just as pale as ever. This is despite Natlan seemingly appearing to be an amalgamation of Aztec, Mayan, and Incan influences mixed with West African influences, as well as some Islander influences. This resulted in great backlash from players who feel the game is ripping from those cultures, while implying their skin tones are too unappealing to market. On the one hand, Genshin wants to take inspiration from various cultures by designing its nations after them, but on the other hand, it delivers a slap in the face to the people of those cultures by sending a message that their skin tones are not beautiful enough to sell characters. It's, once again, mixed messaging, basically saying your culture is beautiful and marketable, but you are not. However, due to it being a fantasy game, a lot of players don't see it worth the mention. Their standpoint is that the game merely takes inspiration from other cultures, but it doesn't have to accommodate past that. Thus, they simply label the ones calling for representation complainers. The problem is Genshin's own lack of responsible handling of identity, though. It doesn't know what it wants to do with cultures. It wants to elevate and monetize them. It wants to give them a time in the spotlight. But it doesn't want to honor the people of these cultures by representing the characters with matching skin tones. The problem with that is, the cultures would not exist without the people first. And for some around the world, it's hard, if not impossible, to separate their skin tone from their culture, as their race is directly tied to significant parts of it and their history. Those on the other end, though, see it as simple inspiration, not full-on representation, especially those from less multicultural societies. Does skin tone matter that much? As well, they view it as a business decision, as pale skin today and throughout Chinese history is one of their cultural beauty standards. With that being the case, pale skin is used to sell characters to the Chinese audience. Those who want darker skin tones feel not only underrepresented, they feel exploited and insulted. It's seen as a company pillaging their culture, while sending a message that they, the people, are too unattractive and not marketable enough to portray their own culture. Now, as a Black American, I have my own opinions on this, as we all likely do. I will say this outright, I align with those who feel they aren't being represented correctly. Throughout the USA's own history, and even in present day, trends were or are started by Black Americans, only to spread, sometimes around the country and sometimes worldwide, without attribution or recognition to Black Americans. However, due to the homogeneous state of countries like China, where Genshin Impact comes from, what race means to me and what race means to them are two totally different things. In the city I live in, when I leave my house, I see plenty of Black Americans, White Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans on any given day. When someone from China leaves their house, they see over 90% Chinese people, and that's in a country of over 1 billion people. This is not excusing Hoyoverse. As a global company, they are the ones who are deciding to market outside of their own country. No one told them to take inspiration from outside cultures, and no one told them to go global. And by monetizing cultures, I absolutely believe they have a responsibility to at least attempt to honor the people of those cultures respectfully. But from China, a country that is largely homogeneous, it's worth remembering that people there simply don't have to consider race every day. Representation is likely not a first or even second thought for those who are represented at basically all times. And this is why I give them a little more of a pass than I would a gaming company from the USA. If a USA-based gaming company ignored cultural sensitivities, I'd just straight up call it out. Maybe even boycott depending on how egregious the offense. There'd be zero excuse, as our society is multicultural and multiracial. Again, I can't leave my house without seeing people of various races. But with Hoyoverse being Chinese, yes, I will speak up about it just like I'm doing right now, but it's not quite the same offense. In their case, it seems to be more so from a mixture of ignorance and a lack of multicultural exposure, rather than malice. Again, it's not an excuse necessarily. They need to learn that if they are going to be global with their products, that pale Chinese beauty standards aren't the only ones in the world. That's not just a concept they have to consider either. All global companies are having to learn this. American ones too. You better believe that anytime an American company makes a product that will be sold in China, there's someone in the marketing department analyzing whether there's anything in that product that will be offensive to people in China. And you better believe that when there is something offensive to people in China, Chinese consumers also make it known. such as when Apple, a US-based company, offended Chinese consumers with stereotypical imagery. It was a big deal and occurred as recent as September 2023. See, the notion that offensive depictions is an outward-only issue, or something that only the West is concerned about, is just false. China itself gets offended at offensive depictions and inaccurate representations. The nuances between Apple's blunder and Hojoverse's are that Apple's misrepresentation was in an advertisement, whereas Hojoverse's is in a fantasy game. Also, Apple's depiction was a crude stereotypical one of Chinese people, whereas Hojoverse's is a case of complete lack of proper depiction. But these nuances are irrelevant to the two main points, which are 1. That companies seeking global consumers are expected to consider global sensitivities nowadays, and 2. That negative consumer responses to failed representation, whether the lack thereof or crudely stereotypical, isn't uniquely Western or American. The medium in which this occurs, whether in an advertisement, in a fantasy game, a song, whatever, is besides the point. Don't take my word for it though. Columnist and former editor of the Global Times, Hu Xijin, put it best when talking about the Apple situation. Quote, "On one hand, we must safeguard our nation's dignity and fight back against obvious malicious provocations. On the other hand, we shouldn't indulge in our own sensitivity." But he also warned Americans to be, quote, "more careful and cautious, and to avoid, quote, pictures and text that may cause misunderstandings among Chinese people." Taking inspiration from a culture while signaling to its people that their skin tone is not marketable enough is doing that exact thing Mr. Hu Xijin spoke of. The people of those cultures are very certain about their own identities, but as far as Genshin goes, it doesn't handle the identities very well. It wants to use the inspirations, but it doesn't want to honor the people. That is mixed messages to some players, and for that reason, Genshin, not the players, is the one with the uncertain identity. What are we doing into that? Like, really, what are we doing? The story and narration causes less division than the other pillars of uncertain identity, but it's still no less confusing to players. It seems like the game isn't sure where it wants to go, even this late into the game. As well, the Traveler, while often played up as a self-insert, is actually treated as anything but. You can't make your own consequential decisions in the story. You can't turn down particular requests. You can't even just say no, unless that's what the Traveler themselves want. Dialogue choices have obvious results that lead to the same conclusion, giving a meaningless illusion of choice, when in actuality one of the choices could have just been treated as another dialogue line without selection. The Traveler doesn't take into account the player's own morals, ethics, or thoughts at all. They just do what they want, and there's no faction loyalties, no good or bad alignments, no trust levels, no alternate means to resolving issues. And this is in contrast to some other games where a dialogue choice has actual effect on the game's story and outcome as a whole. It's not a new concept either. I can personally recall one of my earliest experiences with a game of this type going all the way back to 2003's Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic on the original Xbox, where certain word choices and decisions affect your light and dark alignment, aka your Jedi or Sith alignment. The whole game's story changes as a result, with you either defeating the Sith or taking up the mantle depending on what you've done. Genshin is not that. The story is on rails. You can't deviate from the scripted events. Yet the Traveler is treated in such a way. such as not being able to speak so that we can insert our own perceived voices, and with being able to name the traveler what we want. It seems the game wants us to believe it's our own story, but we're not allowed to make it our own story. And worst of all, they have Paimon doing the speaking for us, which goes against the whole point of a silent self-insert protagonist in the first place. The Traveler isn't a great self-insert, but even if they were, someone doing the speaking for them breaks that. The game doesn't know how it wants to treat its main character or story. It's not as divisive an issue as the other pillars, but it's still an observational one that contributes to the overall notion that Genshin sends mixed messages and signals. That it's unsure what it wants to be or how to treat certain elements. It may not have players as angry at each other as the other pillars, but it does have many players scratching their heads all the same. How much are we supposed to care about the Traveler's issues when their story only moves forward every so often? How much are we supposed to insert ourselves into their trials and tribulations, as if it's our own adventure? Are we the observers, or are we the doers? Some players are strongly invested into these things, and other players could care less, but I'd have to say that either way, the narration, story direction, and Traveler's own uncertain identity are definite contributors to Genshin Impact's overall uncertain identity. There's something to be commended and respected about a game that tries to appeal to several kinds of players at once. The attempt to transcend all boundaries. At the same time though, there's something to note about a game that confuses its players on what it's supposed to be. By selling combat power instead of anything else, Genshin's economy suggests to players that it's a combat-heavy game, but its very few combat-heavy modes would suggest otherwise. Players of both ends then view each other as existential threats. Genshin's difficulty sometimes suggests that you bring your bests, but other times you're left to do whatever you wish. Often players of both ends can't fathom what the opposite sees in the game. Genshin's time investment suggests that one should only stay on a few minutes a day, while strangely requiring them to play for hours a day if a particular story demands it. Players who want more gameplay time are told it's not that kind of game, while those who say they'd like to speed up the fluff in the game are made to sit through all that fluff with no way to expedite it. The game targets various groups, the game takes inspiration from cultures but not the people, the game isn't for sure how to let players insert themselves. Genshin is a good game despite all these conflicting viewpoints though. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing to appeal to various kinds of players, but doing so in undecisive ways can just as well leave players confused about what the game is trying to offer. If the game won't commit to any particular aspect, then players are left to draw their own conclusions about what the game is. They have to develop their own truths. But naturally, when another's conclusion doesn't match, it results in accusations that the one with the opposite view must have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the game is. If the game outlined its own truths, its own identity, there'd be less debate. But it doesn't, and on top of it sends mixed messages and mixed signals to both sides that they're right. It results in neither player necessarily being wrong, and players of both sides know they aren't wrong because they have the justifications from Hoyoverse and Genshin to back it up. It's just, so does the other side, because the messages, the signals, are mixed. So, two sides are confident they aren't wrong, and they aren't wrong to think they aren't wrong. That's just naturally what happens when a company tells two sides, yes, you're correct. That's the part all players need to remember and consider when engaging in a conversation about this game though. The opposition likely doesn't have the view they have because they want the worst for the game, or to be antagonistic or exclusive, but the company just tells them they are correct. As correct as what they tell you you are, or signal to you. Try to temper yourselves when you're having any kind of hot topic discussion about Genshin, because the fact of the matter is, the thing you were arguing against likely isn't actual malice from the opposite side, but rather just a conclusion that was drawn from Hoyoverse and Genshin Impact's own mixed messaging. It's not that the person with the opposing view doesn't know what the game is or what it should be, nor is it that you don't know what the game is or what it should be. It's the game that doesn't know what itself is, and tells everyone, I'm this thing, but I'm also that. Sure, there are some bad actors out there that just want to watch the world burn. But hey, for the most part, most players just have a view of the game that was installed within them by Hoyoverse. And whether that aligns with what you think or not, it's all due to Genshin Impact's own uncertain identities. Now, can y'all please grow up?